Welcome back to Are We Fucked, the podcast where we ask all the hard questions and sometimes just sit back and laugh at the absurdity of it all. I'm Lisa Camillo, your friendly neighborhood anthropologist and filmmaker, bringing you all the deep existential chats. Today, we dive deep, literally this time, into human survival strategies that could one day help us navigate the worst of climate change. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Melissa Ilardo, an interdisciplinary researcher who's been studying superhuman populations like the Bajo sea nomads of Indonesia and the Haenyeo divers of Korea. These incredible groups have evolved some wild adaptations for breath-holding diving, and Melissa's research could lead to life-changing insights. I'm Lisa Camillo, an anthropologist and filmmaker, and let's just say this episode is as cool as it gets. Superhuman cool. Hello, Melissa. Welcome on our show. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Salt Lake City, Utah.
How is it going? How's the weather there?
Oh, it's very hot. We hit some record-setting temperatures and we have more of a heat wave on the way.
Wow. You generally have a pretty cool climate, right? Because you have snow, you have beautiful mountains as well. Famous for skiing, right?
Yeah. So we have, famous snow. Our license plates say best snow on earth because we have this incredible lake effect snow normally. So we have the Great Salt Lake, and the way that weather interacts with the lake, we get this really incredible snow. But yeah, with these increased heat waves, that's kind of threatened because the lake is actually drying out.
It's dry out? No way. What?
Yeah. Not yet, but we're on our way there. So there's a lot of talk of conserving water because of how things are changing.
Oh, wow. That's really sad. Wow. Okay. So I wanted to talk to you because of what you do and your research. You are looking into the evolution of the superhumans, and that's really exciting. You are a geneticist, which is really fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about your work, what you do, and the things you've discovered? Because they're really, really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always been interested in evolution. In our lab, we partner with indigenous populations who live in extreme environments or, have these extreme lifestyles in order to survive. And we look for ways that maybe those lifestyles and environments have actually shaped their genes over many generations. And so far, we've partnered with a number of diving populations. So these are people who hold their breath and dive in order to get everything they need. So they're subsistence divers. And we have found that they've actually evolved to be better at diving.
That's incredible. So this happens in Indonesia and also in Korea. They're all women in Korea.
That's right. Yeah. In Korea, the Haenyeo divers.
Why?
Well, it's an interesting question because we're not really sure. But if you look at diving populations and kind of the extremes of Earth in terms of like low temperatures, it tends to be a lot of all-female divers. So that's definitely something that we want to explore going forward.
That's really cool. I remember my dad, since I was a kid, taught me a little bit about genetics. He's not a geneticist, but he was quite fascinated about all this stuff. And also the fact that, for example, Aboriginal people have noses that are wider, so they can breathe better. The hot air flows better. Is that right? Things like this is an adaptation to their own environment. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one specifically, but yeah, when you look at populations, human populations, non-human populations, there are quite a few adaptations to different environments. One of the most famous ones is Tibetans living at high altitude. So when you go to high altitude, your body responds by producing more red blood cells to compensate for the lower oxygen that you have at high altitude. But the problem with that is that too many red blood cells makes your blood really thick, and that can be problematic for a number of reasons. But one of the ways that it most impacts humans is in pregnancy. So pregnant women at high altitude have higher rates of miscarriage and other complications of pregnancy. And so over many generations, Tibetans have actually adapted so that they don't develop that thick blood. And so they're able to live at high altitude.
That's amazing. I turned to Buddhism when I was a teenager, and I was reading a lot of books on Buddhist monks, and it was really fascinating lives in such high altitude and such harsh climates. And one of the things that kind of forced a little bit the resistance to the cold to babies. And I remember they actually used to leave them outside. And if they survived the night, they would be all good. If they didn't, oh well, too bad, because they had to be strong enough to survive those temperatures. So yeah, I found it very fascinating. Also, you can do that. You can sort of try to force that genetic mutation, right?
Yeah, there are a few things there. So there's forcing, that would be kind of like a forced natural selection, which is interesting. And I have actually also heard that the Bajo, the divers in Indonesia who I partnered with, and I don't know if this is true, but this is what they told me, will pass a baby under a canoe. And if it makes it to the other side, that's a baby, because it's diving already as a baby, it's able to go under the water and survive. So that reminds me of the example that you just shared. But then there's also, especially with cold, humans have an incredible ability to adapt in a physiological sense. So we have, genetic adaptation, which happens over many generations, thousands of years. And then we have physiology adaptation, which is happening, it can happen within hours, days, months, things like that. And we know that cold exposure, much like heat exposure, you can actually adapt and better tolerate extremes of those temperatures just through exposure.
Interesting. Wow. So let's go back to your study, because I've seen actually a short documentary somewhere, I remember, and it was so fascinating. So tell me a little bit, and let's explain to those that haven't seen it or don't know enough about them. Tell me a little bit what you learned through that.
So the Bajo sea nomads, they're called sea nomads because, like many nomadic populations, their traditional lifestyle is nomadic, except unlike many other nomadic populations, they're traveling on the sea. So they're living traditionally in these houseboats, getting everything they need from the sea, interacting with land very minimally. They even say that Bajo children are on the land so infrequently that they often learn how to swim before they learn how to walk. So these people are doing this through a combination of fishing from the surface and things like that, but also through breath hold diving. And they've used this to survive for thousands of years. So we were interested in seeing, is this something that they're just really good at because they do all the time? Or is it something that they've actually evolved to do? So again, is it a physiological adaptation, which can happen in the lifetime of a single person? Or is it a genetic adaptation? And what we found was, so I went out there during my PhD and met the population, proposed the study. They were really interested. So I went back with a portable ultrasound machine and measured spleen size. And so the spleen is an organ you don't really think about very often. You could survive without a spleen. Yeah. So it seems like, how important could it really be? But it's actually really important in terms of something called the mammalian dive reflex. And so this is the response that happens in the body of all mammals, including humans, when you hold your breath and you're underwater. So we have this natural trigger that says, okay, I need to conserve oxygen. And so your body slows down your heart rate. It decreases the size of the blood vessels in your extremities. So it's pushing that oxygen-rich blood closer to the organs that need it the most. And your spleen contracts. Wow. And so your spleen is a reservoir for red blood cells. And when it contracts, it pushes those red blood cells into circulation. So you get this oxygen boost through the mammalian dive reflex. So in seals and other diving mammals, it has been shown that spleen size has increased in order to increase their dive capacity through natural selection. And so we thought, okay, if this happened in seals, the Bajo are spending, 60% of their working day underwater. So maybe we'd see the same thing to be true in these really unique humans. And so we took the ultrasound machine down and measured their spleen size. And sure enough, they had larger spleens.
Oh, that's so cool.
I can share more details about it, but
yeah, that's really fascinating. It's good enough for us mortals to understand the spleen function. Thank you. Can you tell us what's the difference between normal humans' breath holding length and a superhuman like this population?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's really hard to say because you have some really extraordinary humans out there, and like competitive breath hold or apnea diving, as they call it, has become really popular. And you have people doing absolutely unbelievable things, or they're holding their breath for a very long period of time, either floating in a pool or they're, diving to incredible depths. And the Bajo are diving really functionally. So they're diving to feed their families. So no one's out there timing their dives. They're not trying to maximize the length of their dives. But what we can see is they're extremely active underwater. So some of these breath hold records are based on people just floating still in a pool, which is still amazing, not to take anything away from that. But you see a Bajo diver, and they dive so deep that they're neutrally buoyant. So they're walking on the floor of the ocean.
What?
And it looks like they're walking. They look like hunters on land. They're carrying their spear gun and they're just stalking their prey, it looks like.
Oh, so cool.
And they'll shoot a fish, shove it in their belts, and then keep going and shoot another fish. And so they're really
What?
active. And so maybe they're only holding their breath for a few minutes at a time, which is still more than I can do.
Same.
But it's really active underwater.
That's really cool. Wow. Okay. What else? Oh, so we talked about the Koreans one were all females. Why is that in particular?
Yeah, we're not really sure. It's interesting. That's something that has been, if you read some historical accounts of Aboriginal Australian populations in Tasmania specifically, where the water is also quite cold, because in Korea the water is very cold. It's also all female divers. And so we're not sure if this is something to do with the fact that women generally carry more fat, although you would actually expect women generally have poorer circulation. And so this is, the classic, like women in the office have a sweater because they're cold all the time. So you would think that women would actually get colder faster. And yet in these places with cold water, we see all women diving. In Korea, some people attribute it to the fact that at a certain point, there was a tax that was only on men's work. And so women took over because they weren't being taxed in the same way. But we do have records of female divers in East Asia as far back as 2,000 years ago. So it seems like it's coming from a long tradition that's driven by something other than taxes.
I was thinking, when you spend a lot of time, like I sail, I love sailing. And when you spend a lot of time on a sailboat, you get sea legs. So basically, you just tend to sway a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that. One of my favorite things that we found out when we were with the Bajo is one of the divers that we worked with. He's always in the water. He's very infrequently walking. And my colleague who came with me accidentally touched his foot at one point and said, "Oh my goodness, his feet are so soft." And he realized that the bottoms of his feet were like baby's feet because he's never walking. He's always in the water. So he just had this incredibly soft feet.
How funny. That's really interesting. Wow. So we got you here because we want to know, looking at what the world is heading towards, if we could adapt fast enough to the changes, to climate change, not having enough oxygen in the air, more humidity. We've been talking about wet bulb temperatures and how there's going to be so much humidity that it's really going to be hard to survive and the organs might shut down and all this kind of stuff. Okay, let's put a real scenario and then a fictitious scenario. Let's say that, okay, we don't have enough time, and let's then see if we would have enough time, how we would adapt physically and genetically. Can we adapt fast enough to the changes that we're seeing outside?
So in genetics, when we talk about evolution in humans, at least, generally, like 2,000 years is considered incredibly fast for evolution. So fast that people doubted whether the Bajo, in the time that they've been diving, would have had time to adapt. So 2,000 years, which seems like a very long time from our current perspective of how the climate is changing, is just like a blink of an eye, an evolutionary time scale.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not sure we have 2,000 years to adapt to some of these changes that are happening. Yeah.
No, not at all.
That said, I mean, it's hard to know. Could it happen? Maybe, but it's certainly not the kind of time scales that we've been evolving on so far as a species.
So yeah, reading about the Bajo Sea nomads, the first thing that I thought was the connection to my film industry, the movie Waterworld, where humans have adapted to a world full of water. So they had, what is it in English? The gills. So they have gills and they started to be the membrane. They have the membrane between them.
Webbed.
What do you call the
webbed fingers?
Yeah, webbed fingers, yeah. So hypothetically, let's look at a hypothetical future where we have enough time to evolve. How fast can humans adapt generally? How long does it take?
It depends on whether a mutation is already present in the population. So if there are already people walking around with webbed fingers and suddenly that becomes really valuable, then that is able to increase. It depends on, the mutation has to be there and it has to be heritable. Because some of these changes, if you have webbed fingers, maybe your children won't necessarily have that. But if you have them and that's something you pass down, then, we can start to see this spread through the population a lot faster because the people who have that have an advantage in whatever mutation we're talking about.
Yeah.
But if we have to wait for that mutation to arise, most mutations that happen are actually we never even see because they're lethal to the embryo. And so the vast majority of mutations are so harmful that we never even see them. So to have a mutation arise that is beneficial, we have to wait for that. And that becomes a game of chance because we don't know if it will arise. The first person who had blue eyes, that was a mutation that became very widespread because it was attractive or there was whatever benefit that there was. But until that arose, there was no chance of that spreading through the population.
And I guess when we are so many now, we're billions, it's going to be a lot slower than a smaller population, right?
Right. Yeah. So the bigger the population, the longer it takes for something to pervade the population. But you do also have a greater chance of one of those, beneficial mutations popping up.
Mm. To adapt to this world that is hotter, what sort of mutation do you think humans could see?
Yeah, well, so one of the tricky things is, like you just said, it's both more humid and drier. So, there's all these extremes that are happening in the same environment. So in Utah, for example, you mentioned we have these beautiful mountains and tons of snow in the winter. And yet this week we're going down to single digits of humidity because we're just having this incredible heat wave with really dry air. So it's hard to find any kind of physiological change that's beneficial in both of those environments. And so that also works against evolution and natural selection, because if you have one trait that makes you better at surviving dry air, maybe it's really bad then for you in the winter or something like that. I think the best way to think about some of these, where the potential is, like where we could go in terms of surviving some of these things, is to look at species that already survive. So, looking at animals that live in really humid rainforests or really dry deserts, things like that. So if we look at other species that have evolved to survive in these niches, we can say like, oh, how are they doing it? What works for them? So, like with low oxygen, it's interesting to look at obviously the humans who are good at living at high altitudes or holding their breath. But it's also interesting to look at birds that migrate, across the Atlantic, and they're going so high in the atmosphere that they're experiencing incredibly low oxygen levels. And yet they survive that.
How do you do that?
Well, that's an interesting overlap actually with the Bajo divers, because they seem to have an interesting regulation of their thyroid hormones. These birds, I can't remember the name right now, but they have this massive increase in thyroid hormones close to when they do this migration. And we believe that the large spleen size that we observed in the Bajo is actually driven also by thyroid hormones. So there may be something about thyroid hormones that helps in general in cases of low oxygen. But that's something we still have to figure out.
We're trying to grasp some sort of solutions here because it's a very dire situation, and trying to figure out what are the possibilities of humans surviving what we're heading towards. So
yeah,
very interesting.
It's hard to be optimistic about it from a human genetics perspective because, like I've said, it takes us a really long time to evolve, even when, we have really optimal conditions for creating that natural selective pressure. And so having this like very sudden change that's inconsistent just really doesn't set up kind of the perfect experiment in terms of creating a generation of humans that will survive.
Absolutely. Have you looked into as well? We talked a bit about animals, other animals, because looking also at humans want one thing. And you know what? Fuck it. If we go extinct, it was our fault. But animals, it's not their fault. And us contributing to their demise, it's really, really upsetting. So looking at animals, for example, the ocean, through your eyes, what do you think can happen? What is the future of most mammals? Who is going to survive, basically? Is there going to be fungi or cockroaches and insects? Because they're disappearing as well. So what do you think is going to be the future of nature?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, just going back to the oceans in general, I think part of the problem is that we just have too many people, and that puts pressure on all resources, including the ocean. So one of the things that you see with the Bajo is that some communities are basically forced into the Bajo are providing the majority of fish for Asia, essentially. So all of the fish that's consumed, a lot of it is coming from Bajo fishermen in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Malaysia. They are the dominant fishing people of those regions. And in a lot of cases, they're forced into using dynamite to fish, which is, of course, really devastating for reefs. But it's also they're trying to feed their families. So when you actually are there with them, you're like, okay, I understand why, even though this is not sustainable, in this moment, you're trying to survive. And so you're doing this practice. And they're not even trying to feed themselves. When for the last 2,000 years, when they were only focused on, taking care of their own families and their own people, they were fishing incredibly sustainably. Diving is a very sustainable practice. But now that they're trying to feed the billions of people who are eating these fish, they're forced into these practices that are ultimately going to be really damaging for the ocean environment. Generally, I think all over the world, the practices that we're doing to try to sustain this population that we have are just, that's a big factor in what's destroying, the environment, which then affects all these animals. And I think in terms of what will survive, it's just so hard to say because, I mean, the only reason we think mammals survived the last major extinction event and, became the dominant category of species on the planet is because they were somewhat nocturnal. They were adapted to the colder nights. And so then when the global temperature dropped, dinosaurs didn't survive, but mammals did. And so it's so hard to say what will be the catastrophic event that pushes the Earth beyond the point of recovery and what animal will be best adapted to that condition.
So, for example, if it's nuclear, for example, what will survive? I guess mainly insects?
There are like radioactive resistant bacteria, I think. So who knows? Maybe it'll be bacteria would take over.
Nice.
Yeah, hard to say. Yeah, depending on what the effects of that would be. But yeah, I think radioactivity definitely isn't good for really any species.
Yeah, but I heard that in Chernobyl, for example, there was some studies that they've done on the animals that survived. They had wolves that survived the radiations and all sorts of local animals that are evolving.
Yeah, I saw the study. I haven't had a chance to read it, but it could be an interesting opportunity. So one of the effects of radiation is that it damages DNA. And we do have built-in mechanisms to repair DNA, all species do. But often those repair mechanisms just can't keep up with the damage that's happening. And so it may be that's something that's evolving is the ability to repair that damage faster because it's happening so quickly in those cases.
Yeah, interesting. This is completely left field, but I was just watching a new documentary. It's a series. I think it's called The Man with 1,000 Babies. Have you heard about that one?
Is this a sperm donor who had? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a sperm donor that went crazy. And apparently it's a whole huge thing. It's not just him. Sorry for the spoilers, but it's these white guys that think that they could go anywhere in the world and spread the genetics. And I'm wondering if in the future, it's nuts. Yeah, even in Africa saying, oh, we're going to turn Africa white.
Oh, wow.
And it's just disgusting. Yeah, it's really disgusting. But I'm wondering if in the future, in order to speed up the genetic mutation and to adapt better, because now these guys have thousands of kids all over the world with the same genetics profile, which is really dangerous for inbreeding and things like that. So yeah, I'm wondering this crazy future what's going to hold if even something so extreme like this.
Yeah. And it is like you said, so if there were someone carrying beneficial genetic mutations and they were able to spread that or whatever, if that were the future, like you said, the problem is now you have decreased genetic diversity because everybody's kind of descending from the same individual. And so that does cause problems when you have, people with the same essentially genetic heritage mixing in later generations. Another thing that's interesting is as we're seeing like with globalization, the pairing of different ancestral backgrounds can create really interesting combinations because, for the first time ever, you have a variant that's really common in one population combined with one that's really common in another population. And sometimes that's actually we're seeing causing disease in a way that we never knew it could. But maybe it could also create benefit, or maybe these different backgrounds that when they're combined create a new generation that actually is able to better survive or something like that.
Yeah, because I guess even like dark skin is actually very good for high radiations when you have countries that are very, very hot and so more resistant to skin cancer and things like that. So mixing white skin with darker skin, it can actually improve the resistance to the sun, right? So that's beneficial. But you mentioned like something that can also be negative. What are the examples?
I'm trying to remember the exact example, but I believe that I remembered hearing about, and I'm sorry if I'm getting the details wrong, but some Pacific Island ancestry combined with a specific European ancestry that creates a really high rate of a certain kind of disease. You have this variant, and variant is just what we call a mutation, a small genetic change that's unique to a certain population. And so you have one that on its own is totally harmless, but then when combined with this other one, creates a problem. And this is something that, because for many generations, the world wasn't really mixing in the way that it is now, there are combinations that we've never seen genetically. And so it's something we have to consider when we think about the future of medicine, because also, medical genomics is very heavily influenced by research on Europeans. And so as we have, as we're applying some of these ideas to populations who do not have European ancestry, there are all kinds of things that we just don't know right now.
What are the other examples that you've seen of genetics mutating because of the environment? Other examples?
There aren't too many from humans just because we're a relatively young species. We haven't diverged for that long. And a lot of mutations or, adaptations happen over a very long time scale. And so in a lot of cases, we just haven't been around long enough to adapt to some of these environments. But one of the ones that is common throughout most humans on the planet is an adaptation to drinking milk. You have lactose tolerance and lactose intolerance. And so people who are able to tolerate lactose, it's because they actually have an adaptation. Because being able to consume milk from animals into adulthood was so beneficial early on that people who were able to consume that survived and passed on their genes more often than people who weren't. And so we see that happening in the history of the human species, not only once, but twice. So actually in 2 different times, humans adapted to be able to tolerate. It's called lactase persistence. So you keep this enzyme that normally we have just as babies to consume our mother's milk. But then, there's a mutation that causes you to keep that all the way into adulthood so you can continue to consume milk.
Oh, that's interesting. And when did it happen and where? Is it in particular places where they haven't seen that mutation?
Yeah, so the mutation happened in, I don't know the exact timing, this is something I should know, but in Europe, but it also happened in Africa. So, you have this out of Africa migration into Europe eventually, and it happened there. And then I think around the same time happened in Africa. But some populations had already moved on from Europe before that happened. And so that's why you see a lot of East Asian populations in particular that have lactose intolerance because they didn't get that mutation before they moved on.
Ah, okay. Yeah, because thinking now about it, actually, in Asia, you don't see food with milk inside. You don't have really cheese. You have like coconut milk.
Yeah, because a lot of people are lactose intolerant. Another one is in Greenland. The Greenlandic Inuit consume a lot of marine mammals that have a really high amount of fat. And so, if you or I were to eat that high of a fat content or lipid content, the way our metabolism works, we would develop heart disease. And so obviously, since that's how they survived, they needed an adaptation to better metabolize those lipids. And so they actually metabolize fat in a way that's different from the way that we do.
Okay, I've got another one for you. What about alcohol?
Yeah.
Because I know different populations can process alcohol differently.
Yeah, there's an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase, I believe, that is involved in how we process alcohol. But I'm not actually sure whether that's evolutionary or just kind of, because you also have differences between population that happen because of something called genetic drift. And so this is just kind of random chance where, sometimes something increases in frequency or decreases in frequency just through chance. So I'm not sure, but, maybe there was an adaptive advantage to being able to drink some booze that changed the frequency in different populations.
Yeah, because I am Roman. My roots are Roman. So we definitely started everybody else's on wine.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Melissa. It was a very interesting conversation. So thank you so much for that. And it's a shame that we won't evolve fast enough, but oh well, it's our fault too.
We'll have to figure something else out.
Yeah, hopefully we'll fix the environment before we get to the point. Thank you so much, Melissa.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Well, folks, that was a deep dive into the superhuman world of breath-hold divers and evolutionary magic. A massive thank you to Dr. Melissa Ilardo for taking us on an underwater adventure that's way cooler than anything Aquaman is up to. If you want to keep up with her groundbreaking work or maybe figure out how to grow your own set of gills, as you would definitely need them in the near future, check out her website at superhumanlab.org. Trust me, it's a rabbit hole worth diving into. And speaking of amazing feats, did you know that Are We Fucked is proudly all women-led and fully powered by the sun? That's right, we're basically solar-powered Wonder Women over here, making every episode not just a step towards environmental awareness, but also a testament to sustainable practices. We're saving the planet one podcast at a time, or at least trying to when we're not busy contemplating our own extinction. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to help us keep the lights on, consider buying us a coffee or, contributing to our caffeine fund. You can make a donation on PayPal or grab one of our fabulous t-shirts. Links are in the episode description. Every little bit helps. And who knows, your support might just fund the episode where we finally figure out if we're truly fucked or not. Don't forget to subscribe, rate us, and set a reminder to tune in every Wednesday on your favorite podcast platform. We've got a lineup that'll make you feel smarter, or at least more informed about how weird and wonderful our world really is. Thank you for tuning in, Climate Warriors. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep fighting the good fight. This is Lisa Camillo signing off. Take care, and remember, the future is ours to shape.